Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I want to talk to you guys about sodium. I think that salt is one of the tastiest of the spices that we tend to put in our food, but it can also cause us a lot of issues, especially those related to heart attack or stroke. And it's important for us to really talk about that. Y'all know that I'm really big about understanding the whys instead of just the whats in order to feel that I'm really learning and really growing as a person. It also just helps me to make decisions in general. If I understand the why, then I feel that I understand it better overall, and I can make better decisions in general about my health. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that. First up, we're going to talk about just sodium in general. So if you are like me, you're probably getting more sodium than is generally recommended. I like to put a lot of chicken broth in my food, so when I'm cooking mashed potatoes in particular, I will boil the mashed potatoes in chicken broth instead of just into water, because it tastes better. It imparts a lot of flavor into the food that we're consuming, and I think that that's really important. We want food to taste good. Otherwise, we're going to feel like a sim character where we're just going through the motions of being people in everyday life. I feel that I'm wasting a lot of time when I'm cooking or pumping gas or peeing in general, because I try to stay super hydrated. And so a lot of my time feels like it's spent doing these type of tasks that are very routine and repetitive. And in that regard, I'm just sitting here like, is there something I can do to really prevent how much time I'm spending doing these tasks? But that may just be me. That makes me feel like a sim a lot though. So I want to really think about ways to make my food delicious so that I still want to eat it, without it necessarily being full of those delicious fats like butter or salt. Salted butter is my favorite. I really mostly use unsalted butter for making baked goods in general, or caramel for my caramel macchiatos. I have been making them with salted butter just because I was out of unsalted butter for a while, but we picked some up at the store the other day, and hopefully that will be a little bit better going forward. Although, let's be honest, I couldn't really recognize much of a difference. So that's neither here nor there. But if you're like me, most of us really aren't aware of how much sodium we're ingesting into our diets. I want you to think about a single teaspoon of table salt. So that is sodium chloride, combination of the elements sodium and chloride, NaCl. That has 2,325 milligrams of sodium in just a single teaspoon of table salt. That is way more than the daily recommended amount according to the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet that we discussed a few episodes ago in our episode about different types of diets. It's not just table salt we have to deal with either. There are tons of processed foods that contain a ton of sodium. we really want to think about how we integrate sodium into our diet, because it's not just added sodium per se. It's not what we're personally adding, but it's what's added on in the processing as well. How much sodium is really put into our food as a preservative. So if we watch a lot of Dr. Quinn, if you're like me, or if you watched Old Yeller, you saw how they preserved meats way back in the day with either salt curing or sugar curing, or a mix of both, to really get these foods to last for a long time. We've really not come all that far away from that type of technology nowadays, and a lot of foods, particularly those that are canned, tend to have a lot of salt added to them, which is why folks recommend that you eat more frozen or fresh vegetables whenever you can, whenever socioeconomic status allows. So in that regard, we really want to be mindful about how much of the sodium is in our diets and how we can prevent that much being added, since a single tablespoon is still more than is recommended for a heart-healthy diet. In that regard, we also need to keep in mind that sodium is important for our bodies. It's an electrolyte, just like potassium, and we need to make sure we have some of it, because it's going to help us maintain homeostasis of the fluids in our bodies. It's going to help us with transmitting nerve impulses, and also it is important for the contraction and relaxation of our muscles. So it's really integral in sending these messages to different parts of our bodies to let them know what they're supposed to do. So we do need sodium. We can't cut it out altogether because that's not great for us, but we do want to be mindful of how much we are intaking into our bodies. So in our bodies, our kidneys naturally balance how much sodium is stored in our bodies to make us as healthy as possible. If we have too little sodium in our bodies, then our kidneys will retain it more. And when we have too much, then our kidneys are going to excrete it in our urine. So if for some reason your kidneys can't get enough sodium out of the body, it'll start to build up in your blood, which is not great. Sodium tends to attract and hold water, so your total blood volume is going to increase, and that makes your heart work a lot harder to pump all of that blood through, and it's going to increase the blood pressure in your arteries. That is not great. If you're having trouble with your kidneys and your blood pressure in processing the sodium, then you can get diseases like congestive heart failure, which is really what killed my grandmother. And for her, it was a positive feedback loop between her kidneys and her heart. Part of it was the medication, and it was the 90s. They didn't understand as much as we do today about those positive feedback cycles. But she got congestive heart failure following a large bout with dialysis. So it was a complex issue that caused her ultimate decline. You can also get cirrhosis or chronic kidney disease, and that can make it really difficult for your kidneys to balance your sodium levels within the body. A lot of folks are also more sensitive to the effects of sodium than others. You guys have talked about that a lot, how we're all on these journeys together, but we're at different points. And so much like the Appalachian Trail, we can pop onto the trail at different points. We can pop on this path at different points and go along our merry ways. And some of us, it's going to be easier, and for others of us, it's going to be really difficult. And that's okay. We just have to recognize and accept where we are. So if you're very sensitive to sodium, you're going to retain it more easily. That's going to mean you're going to have more fluid retention, so more water weight overall, and also higher blood pressure than a lot of other folks. And if that becomes a chronic disorder, then it can lead to cardiovascular diseases, also strokes, like ischemic strokes, which is the most common type, as well as kidney disease and congestive heart failure, like what my grandmother had. So if we're really trying to figure out how much is too much, the dietary guidelines for a lot of Americans is to limit your sodium intake to fewer than 2,300 milligrams per day. So it's definitely less than a tablespoon a teaspoon even of salt. I want you to keep in mind that's also the upper limit. So that is the most you can have. That's not like the minimal component of a threshold, like when you're using the dipstick in your car to check your oil and we have the min and the max on it. This is the upper limit on it. You should not have any more than 2,300 milligrams a day. That's a lot. And if you're more sensitive to the effects of sodium, that's going to be a much bigger deal for you. Now, if you aren't sure how much sodium your diet should include and you're not sure how sensitive you are to it, talk to a doctor or a dietitian. They are there to help you. Dietitians tend to work at the hospitals as well, and they're an underutilized resource who are glad to help you figure that out. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the major dietary sources of sodium. Stay tuned.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were introducing the concept of sodium and talking about how it's important to have that in your body at a certain point. We need it for important things in our body like maintaining homeostasis of our fluids, transmitting nerve impulses, and influencing the contraction and relaxation of our muscles. So that's important whether we're sitting or walking or standing or stretching. All of the above. We need that sodium-potassium ion exchange pump to really be working quite well in order to have a proper homeostasis in our bodies. However, just like anything else, too much sodium can be too much of a good thing. So we're going to talk about the major dietary sources of sodium. The average American gets around 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day. So that is 1,100 milligrams more than the maximum of how much is recommended per day. Remember, we only want up to 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, but really much less than that. So if you're getting 3,400 a day, that is 1,100 over what you're looking for. So the main sources of sodium in a typical diet include processed and prepared foods, some in the kitchen and at your table, as well as natural sources. So the majority of sodium in the American diet, at least, comes from foods that have been pre-processed or pre-prepared. A lot of these foods are really high in salt and additives that contain sodium because it helps keep them fresh for longer as well. It's not just about taste, it's also about preservation at that point. So a lot of processed foods like those frozen pizzas, breads, especially those delicious frozen garlic breads on Texas toast that you get in the frozen food aisle, a lot of cold cuts like deli meats, like we discussed in our previous podcast about how they pump them full of saline, as well as bacon, which it tastes like it has a lot of salt in it, so we tend to know that one. But also surprising things like cheese and soups, fast foods, and then anything that is prepared for you, including things that are supposed to be for a healthy diet, like diet foods that are frozen, that have pasta, meat, or eggs in them. All of those are more likely to have a lot of sodium in them. There are also a lot of foods that naturally have sodium in them. Some of those are vegetables, surprisingly enough, and also dairy products, as well as meat and different types of fish, particularly shellfish. So they may not have a ton of sodium in them, but eating those types of foods does contribute to your body's sodium content. It can be a lot more than we're really thinking about because we're not considering how much salt these things naturally have. So, for example, 1 cup of low-fat milk has 100 milligrams of sodium. That might not seem like a lot, but if you're drinking a full glass of milk per day, so you're drinking 8 ounces of it, so a cup of it per day, you're going to have 100 milligrams of sodium already. So even if that's just at breakfast, that's 100 milligrams out of the 2,300 tops that you should be having per day. So now you're down to 2,200, and that's not even counting how much you've perhaps put into your eggs or to your bagel and lox that you're eating for breakfast. It's a lot if you really sit down and think about it. So you also have to think about how much you're adding in the kitchen and at the table. A lot of recipes say that you need to add salt to it, especially if you are baking. And a lot of folks also have salt at their table. Indeed, a ton of different condiments contain sodium. I know soy sauce is a big one for me, and I try to get the low sodium soy sauce, especially the Kikkoman brand, but there's a lot in it. I also like tamari, but 1 tablespoon of soy sauce has almost 1,000 milligrams of sodium in it. That's a ton. So, usually when we're cooking, we don't just use 1 tablespoon of soy sauce. Even if we are out having sushi for dinner, I think a lot of us use at least 2 tablespoons, depending on how much soy sauce we are having with our dinner. And so if you have 2 tablespoons of it, then that leaves only 300 milligrams more for the day for your maximum amount. That means if you put butter on your toast at breakfast or anything like that, you're probably already over it for the day. So to cut down on sodium, there are a few things that we can do. First off, we can try to eat more fresh foods because they're naturally lower in sodium than foods that have been put through canning as a process. A lot of canning involves adding sodium to help them stay fresh longer. The same thing goes for deli meats. Remember we talked about that the other day and how they denature those proteins to get them to stick together and then add more sodium or, like a saline type solution to it to make it both juicier and to make it stay good longer. They also do that to bacon, hot dogs, sausage, ham, all of the really delicious meats, to be honest. So if you're going to buy a meat, then you should buy fresh or frozen poultry or meat that hasn't had a sodium solution added to it, like that saline type solution. You can check the label for that, or you can also ask your butcher. Remember, you can ask the butcher even at the deli counter in your local grocery store as to how much sodium is in these products. And even if they don't know off the top of their head, they have those labels facing them as well, and they can check that for you. It's really important to keep that in mind because it's important for your heart health and for your risk of stroke. A ton of folks in the U.S. every year have heart attacks and have strokes. One of my friends was as young as 17 years old at the first time they had a heart attack. So it can really happen to anyone. We think about it happening mostly to men who are 55 and older, but it's important to keep an eye on it at any age. It's like sleep debt. We want to make sure that we're not accumulating that because it's harder to come back from it. Just like making a C. When you are on the GPA system and you get a 4 for an A, a 3 for a B, and a 2 for a C. You make a single C and it makes it a lot harder to come back from at that point just because of how the math works. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent these issues rather than having to come back and solve the problem later. One of the best tips I can give you is go to a local butcher. Not just the butcher at the deli meat counter, at the meat counter at your grocery store, but go to a local butcher shop if you're able to. We have one here in Texas that's probably about an hour away from me now, but still totally worth it when I go up there. And we'll just take a cooler with us and some freezer packs to keep the food cold. And when we go up there, we'll buy a bunch of food. And with their chicken, you can get a whole fryer chicken, which is just like a whole small chicken, more or less, for pretty cheap. But it doesn't have any of the sodium added. So you're not paying for extra weight that is put on there by the sodium solutions. But you also have to eat that within 2 days. You have to eat it or freeze it within 2 days of purchase to really make sure that it's still good. But that's totally fine with us. It's also a lot easier than you would think to butcher your own chicken. I get why folks are more hesitant about doing that with pork or with beef, but with chicken, it's really easy. You just slice gently down into that joint area. So like for the wing between the shoulder and the actual wing. And then once you get through all of that meat and the sinew, then you can really just rotate that arm and pull it straight out. And it is a lot easier. So you can take it apart yourself at the joints, and that's the easiest way to do it. If you're having to cut through bone, then that's going to be a lot more difficult. But if you do it at the joints, it's going to make for really easy cuts of meat, just like you would get at KFC or any other chicken place. And it's going to be really easy for you to get them apart. It takes a long time to cut through bone, particularly since you need a straight blade to cut through muscle, tendons, and ligaments, versus a serrated blade to cut through stuff such as bone, because you need to displace that bone dust within the kerf. And the kerf is the space between the bones where you've displaced some of that bone dust. So that makes it a little bit different. So if you're going to do it yourself and you want to cut through the bones, you're going to need 2 different types of knife, really. And I say that as someone who went to school for forensic anthropology and has done a lot of work on trauma cut marks to bones. But it is going to be a lot easier for you in the long run if you just slip it into the joint area and then twist it around until you can pull it straight out. Because it's just a little bit of cartilage at that point once you cut through the meat to get through there. Alright, we're going to go on a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some more tips for cutting back on sodium. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We were talking about some ways to cut back on sodium and how to properly butcher a chicken on your own so you can get one from the local butcher shop and have a great chicken on your own that's not full of sodium and pumped full of saline solution. Now we're going to talk about some more tips to cut back on sodium. One of the best ways you can do that is just to cut it off at the pass and look for low sodium products. So I know a lot of us love processed foods, and I totally get that. A lot of it is because they're tasty. They tend to be heavy in carbs and sodium. But if we look for the ones that are labeled low in sodium, then we're going to be better off. So it's a lot like that skinny girl popcorn that we've discussed before, where it's lower in fat, it tends to be lower in sodium as well. Read the labels. I'll say it until I'm blue in the face. It all comes down to reading those labels. That is what is going to give you the best idea of what is in your food. And remember that the labels are specifically per serving. So we have to make sure we're reading how many servings are available per package, when we do buy processed or pre-packaged foods. So if you're able to buy whole grain rice or pasta instead of products that already have seasoning added to it, go for it. Learning to season our foods on our own is one of the best gifts we can give to both our palates and to our health in general. You guys know I'm a huge fan of paprika and turmeric and cardamom and coriander. Just about anything you can add to foods, I have added to it. And once you get used to the combinations and using these frequently, you can really tell what they're going to go well with, and you'll start picking up on it intuitively after a while. It has taken my ex several years to get to that point, but now he is a fantastic cook. When we first started dating, he could only make 3 things. He could make spaghetti noodles, which he would just add butter to for the most part. He did not even make a bolognese or a red sauce with it, with meat. He would also make lentils. Although when he made the lentils, he would cook them kind of into a mush so they didn't have much of a shape or an overall texture to them aside from mush. He could also cook a steak, but it was not great in the way that it was cooked, and it would always come out really tough. But over the years, I've worked with him on that, and he's gotten really invested in the different types of cooking. So now he knows the difference between baking and broiling and frying and sous vide, and can make all kinds of amazing food. He even recently made gravlax, of all things, which is like a Scandinavian food made from curing some type of fish, like salmon is what he used, with sugar and salt. So he cured it on his own in the fridge and was still able to eat it days later, and he didn't get sick, and neither did our friends. So he did a really great job in that regard, and has over the years learned how to make marmalade and everything in a pressure cooker from scratch. I'm super proud of him, and he's getting really good at learning how to season food as well. So a lot of it's just practice. Every now and then you might make something that you definitely don't want to eat, but that's okay. It's just part of learning. The scientific method means that we try something, we find it's not exactly what we thought it would be, and then we try again. You just modify that hypothesis instead of going, oh, well, I guess that gravity doesn't exist because I threw this apple in the water and it floated on top. That's not the way that it works. It's more complex than that. So in that regard, keep trying. Keep your scientific method up, and you will find some things and some processes that work really well for you. Also, everyone's palate is different, and that is totally okay. It's about finding what's best for us individually. So I think a lot of folks have a lot of problems with health food because they don't like specific flavors. So personally, I don't like tofu. I don't like a lot of these grains that are put into different foods. I don't like almond milk, coconut milk, etc. But I find the things that work specifically for me, and I find the flavors that I like. I'm more of a savory food person than a sweets person, and I can make that work for me when I'm looking for health food. So just because you haven't found one yet doesn't mean it's not out there. But if you try to force yourself to eat a lot of health food that you don't like, it's going to be a chore versus finding these spices that really do work for you and make things delicious for you is going to help you a lot. So in addition to looking for products that have low sodium, you can also try to remove the salt from your recipes whenever you can. So there are a lot of recipes like casseroles, stews, soups, meats that you're going to cook that say you need to add extra salt to them. I like to still put salt in them, but put a little bit less than what they recommend. That helps me a ton. So in that regard, it's just dialing back the flavor profile a little bit where I'm like, I wish this had a little bit more salt, but this is fine. It's still edible. And that is just creating a new normal for you. Very similar to how we discuss this for sugar. It's creating that new normal, so you're having a step down program in kind of a way to make sure that you still enjoy your food. So you're still going to eat it, but you're going to overall remove a lot of your body's dependence and craving on it. If you're looking for a particular bunch of recipes and you don't want to do this on your own, you can find cookbooks that have a larger focus on high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease issues and lowering your risks of those. So you can look for some real heart-healthy cookbooks to help you meet those goals halfway without having to do it on your own. You can also limit how much you're using condiments that have a ton of sodium in them. So a lot of salad dressings surprisingly have a lot. I'm sure no one's surprised about how much is in soy sauce or other sauces, ketchups. Ketchup tends to be sweet, but it has a lot of sugar as well as salt in it. And dips, mustard, relish, all of those contain a substantive amount of sodium in them. So you want to be mindful about that as you go along. You also want to make sure that you're using a ton of different spices to season your foods, herbs, flavorings, spices, all of it. You can use fresh or dried herbs, zest, juice from citrus fruit. You can use spices. If you don't want to use the fruit itself, you can use some coriander to give it a light citrus flavor, just to make your meals a little bit tastier. Sea salt is not a great substitute, just so you know. It has about the same amount of sodium that table salt has, but a lot of table salt is iodized, and you need that iodine in your body in order to perform a lot of different processes that your body needs. So you need that iodine. It's important. If you get that Himalayan salt and stuff like that that doesn't have iodine in it, then you need to make sure that you are using a little bit of iodized salt in there as well. You also want to make sure that you're using salt substitutes in a really good manner. They tend to have a mixture of table salt along with some other complex compounds. And to get that salty taste, you might be using too much of the substitute and get too much sodium. Just like artificial sweeteners can lend you to getting more sugar than you actually need, or more sweeteners just to get that amount of sweet flavor you're going for. So you're going to overall intake more carbs and calories than you normally would just to get that in your body. The same thing can work with salt. A lot of salt substitutes also have potassium chloride in it. And although you need potassium in your body for that sodium-potassium exchange pump to help ameliorate some of the problems you might get from getting too much salt in your body, too many potassiums can also cause a lot of problems in your body, especially if you already have kidney problems or if you're taking medication for congestive heart failure or high blood pressure that's associated with retaining more sodium. That's again what happened to my grandmother, and the medications she had for her kidneys exacerbated the congestive heart failure issues and vice versa until it gave her a heart attack and she died. So you want to make sure that you're using those sparingly and in a manner that is going to cause the least harm. All right, we're going to go another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the labels and how to make sure we're purchasing the right types of sodium.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Before the break, we were talking about ways that we can cut back on sodium and how to know when enough is enough. Now we're going to talk some more about making sure we're purchasing the right amounts of sodium and reading the labels a little bit better. So first up, you can taste sodium in your food, but you might not always be able to tell just by taste how much sodium is in your food. So I mentioned bagels earlier, and they tend to not really taste salty. A lot of them are, blueberry flavored or cinnamon raisin flavored, but a regular 4-inch bagel, especially like an oat bran one, has 600 milligrams of sodium. That's a ton. Remember, you're only supposed to have 2,300 milligrams per day, and that is about a quarter of the amount of sodium you're supposed to have per day in a regular 4-inch bagel, which is not even that large of a bagel, particularly in America. I don't think it's really that big. But how do we tell how much is in it? We read the nutrition labels. I will say it till I'm blue in the face. We have to read these nutrition labels. And we don't have to do it in the store. We can read them online at home as well before we go shopping if you'd rather do it there. Just a single slice of whole wheat bread tends to contain about 150 milligrams of sodium. You wouldn't think that it's that much, but it really is. So if you have 2 sandwiches per day, that is 600 milligrams of sodium. If you eat both of those sandwiches on bagels, that is going to be a lot more. That's 1,200 milligrams of sodium. That's a little bit more than half of what you should have per day. So we're going to read those nutrition facts labels. Those are on most packaged and processed foods. If you're using the McDonald's app, they have nutrition information available on the app as well. It's not just ordering online. It's also there to tell you about the nutrition available. It will list the amount of sodium in each serving and whether the ingredients include salt or other sodium-containing compounds, because it's not just table salt, which is the NaCl. It can also be monosodium glutamate, MSG, that we're familiar with a lot of our foods, sodium nitrates, alganates, and citrates, disodium phosphate, baking soda, which might be listed as sodium bicarbonate, as well as baking powder. Those all have sodium in them, and it's important to keep that in mind when we're cooking as well. It's not just going to be foods on top of the stove that ask you to add things that have sodium in them, but also baking recipes. So a lot of baking recipes say add sugar and then add salt, but also baking soda and baking powder. You want to make sure that it rises and everything, but these items also contain a lot of sodium in them. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're cutting this into portions. We also want to make sure that we're avoiding any products that have over 200 milligrams of sodium per serving. Unfortunately, that means that half of an oat bran bagel is generally out of the question unless you're being really mindful of how much sodium you're having throughout the day. But if you're also adding some type of cream cheese or other types of toppings like lox to your bagel, that's going to be very high in sodium. Also, always pay attention to how many servings are in a package. A lot of times you'll think, oh yeah, 1 bagel is 1 serving, but that might not be the case. It could be 2 servings and they expect you to split it in half. It all just depends because they're really trying to make that look as good as they can, and so your nutrition facts might be skewed a little bit by them changing it into a different serving size than what you expect. It may say that 2 cookies is a serving size or 6 cookies, depending on where you're obtaining your cookies from, what brand they are, and all that jazz. So keep an eye on that as well. You also want to make sure that you really understand what's going on those labels. We want to make sure we know the vocabulary and the terminology that they're using. A lot of food is going to say that it has reduced sodium or it's light on sodium, but that doesn't mean that they're low in sodium. So if you are like me and you love chicken noodle soup, there are a lot of cans of chicken noodle soup that say they have about 25% less sodium, but they will still have 524 milligrams of sodium in a single cup of chicken noodle soup. So when it says that, it means it's lower comparatively, but that doesn't mean that the initial product is also at a point that is low enough to really be meaningful for it. It's just lower in sodium than regular chicken noodle soup. But if regular chicken noodle soup has 790 milligrams of sodium in a cup, which is about 1/3 of how much you should have per day, and I think most folks eat at least 2 cups of chicken noodle soup at a time, that's going to be a lot. So even if it has 25% less sodium and is only 524 milligrams per 1 cup, you're generally eating 2 cups of that. And so that is over 1,000 milligrams in a cup. And that's about half of what you can have all day. So if you see something that says sodium free or salt free, that's good. That means that each serving in that product has less than 5 milligrams of sodium per serving. But again, pay attention to those servings. If it says very low sodium, then each one has 35 milligrams of sodium or less. Low sodium has less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. So that is what sodium-free, very low sodium, and low sodium mean. So to put that into context, you should have no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, and low sodium, which is like the highest form of low sodium, means that you have 140 milligrams of it or less per day. So that's almost like a 22nd or so of how much you should have per day. There are a few other sodium labels though. So if they say reduced or less sodium, then that means it contains at least 25% less sodium than the regular version. So think about soy sauce or chicken noodle soup in that capacity. But also think about how much sodium a lot of soy sauce, like regular soy sauce, has in it. It's super salty. That's partly why it's so delicious. So that is not going to be necessarily a very low amount of sodium in reduced sodium soy sauce. It may still have a ton in it, and you need to check how much is in it per serving. Now, for light or light in sodium, those labels mean that the sodium content has at least 50% less than the regular version. So you want to prefer that over reduced sodium or less sodium. If you have a label that says that it's unsalted or no salt has been added, then they have not added any salt during the processing of the food, but the food may normally contain salt. That means that they may still be high in sodium because certain ingredients may be high in sodium. So think about chicken broth in general and how that may just naturally have a lot of sodium in it. Keep an eye on that because unsalted doesn't mean that there's no salt. It's no salt added, which is very similar to what we found when we examined labels for milk, oils, and eggs. That just because it's not added does not mean it's not present. It's really important to keep that in mind. So in general, we want to make sure that we are getting a little bit of sodium, as little as possible, and getting it gradually throughout the day. So sodium is just like any other acquired taste like sushi or wine, etc. You can learn to enjoy having less of it in your food, just like your taste buds can get used to having it in your diet. So we want to make sure that we're gradually lowering how much sodium that we're having in our diets, and our taste buds will adjust accordingly. It's like the step down program I've discussed previously about sugar. You can do the exact same thing with salt. You can also try using seasonings or condiments that are salt-free and then adding your own little bit of salt so you know exactly how much is in there. If you cut back on sodium for a few weeks, you're not going to miss it too much, and a lot of foods may start tasting too salty. So that happened to me with sugar as well, and so I got used to not having as much sugar in my diet, and then things started tasting too sugary. And then after a while, I was reducing the amount of artificial oils I had in my food. And so Little Debbie cakes, which I used to love, started having like a real waxy and oily flavor for me and texture. and they were also just too salty and too sweet, depending on which one I was eating. So it really depends on what precisely you're going for. If you can have up to 1 teaspoon of salt per day, so remember that's a little bit too much, it's like 2,360 milligrams, and you're aiming for fewer than 2,300 milligrams, then if you go down to 1/4 teaspoon of salt per day, that's going to be a huge reduction. And remember, that's not only just at your table that you're adding it on, but also as you're adding it on in cooking. And we have to see what's naturally in that food beforehand as well. Then throw out your salt shaker. If you use less salt, then you're not going to crave it so much, and you'll enjoy the taste of the food itself. So I really enjoy that with my food. I want to make sure my food always has seasoning in it, but I also want to make sure that I am taking good care of my body and not causing any more issues. All right, we're going to go another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the way that salt works in our bodies. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about salt in our body and how we can reduce it overall, as well as to read that label lingo to really suss out what is going on. Now we're going to talk about how much we should really have in our diets. So, as I have said previously, it's really important to have sodium in your diet, particularly for that sodium ion exchange pump. So that helps with your muscles and your nerve function. But again, too much of anything is a bad thing. So how much do we really need for that? The human body is going to help you deal with how much sodium you retain. If we get too much sodium, then we get thirsty. That's one of the reasons that we get thirsty. It's not just a lack of having enough water in our bodies, but also making sure we don't have too much sodium in there. When we get thirsty and drink, then the kidneys are going to expedite getting rid of the amount of salt in our bodies through excreting it through our urine. If you get too much sodium in your body, it's been linked to kidney stones as well as cardiovascular disease, including high blood pressure. So a lot of other types of stones, like gallstones, they may be a lot of calcium in your body, but for kidney stones, too much sodium can do it too. So we tend to think of sodium as being really bad for our hearts and our blood pressure, but it can also be really bad for your kidneys. If you get too little sodium, then you can get hyponatremia. So you're having trouble processing the amount of salt versus water in your body, and you may get dizzy, you may be confused, or have twitches in your muscles, or even seizures. That sounds really scary, right? I mean, it freaks me out quite a bit because y'all know I love a good cheeseburger. I am way more into savory foods and salty foods than I am into sweet ones. But salt can be just as much of a problem as a lot of sweets. We tend to underestimate it because too much sweets can result in issues related to diabetes that are definitely long-term and have a label that everyone is more familiar with. We know what diabetes means, whereas high blood pressure, that's more anomalous. It's like, okay, my blood pressure's high, and? But it can cause a lot of problems. It can lead to ischemia and all types of other problems with our health. So we want to make sure that we're keeping that as low as possible. One of the problems that we really face as Americans is the amount of food we are intaking at restaurants and in drive-thrus. Anything that's super convenient, if it has preservatives in it, because it is in the frozen food section of our grocery store and it's a prepared food. It's not just a frozen vegetable. Or if it's prepared in another section of the grocery store or it already has seasonings added to it, then we may be getting a ton of sodium on it as well. And it's a lot harder to tell that. There are some restaurants, especially fast food restaurants like McDonald's or foods and restaurants like maybe Olive Garden, that will tell you how much is in your food. But a lot of other places, like if you go to a nice restaurant, it's hard to tell how much sodium is in your food. Really fancy restaurants don't really have that on the menu, so that can be really difficult to tell. So you want to limit how much you're eating out, to be honest. And I know that doesn't sound like a ton of fun, but if we're looking out for our heart health over how we love things to be flavored, it's really a wants versus needs dichotomy, and we want to make sure that we are keeping in mind what our body needs. So what we are thinking of as salt is really sodium chloride. That's the NaCl I mentioned earlier. Na is the chemical symbol for sodium, and the Cl is for chloride. So when we talk about sodium or table salt, it's actually only 40% sodium, and all the rest of it is chlorine. So that other 60% is chlorine. So it's 40% Na, 60% Cl. So to know a little bit more about salt and put this in perspective, you need to think about how much is in your table salt. If a food label lists sodium instead of salt, then you need to multiply that sodium number by 2.5 to get a really full picture of the actual salt content. So that's one way that they might try to trick you on these labels. Salt is partly comprised of sodium, so they can get away with listing sodium as it, but if you don't really get that full amount, then it doesn't make sense. So 40 times 2.5 is going to get you to about 100%, which is going to be your salt intake rather than just your sodium intake. It's important to keep that in mind, I think. A lot of Americans also eat way too much salt, and about 75% of the sodium and salt that we intake each day is in processed and pre-prepared food. So we have to keep an eye on that as well. The American Heart Association recommends having no more than 2.3 grams, which is that 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day for those of us who follow the different system of, any measurement in the U.S. really, the imperial system, rather than using the metric system. So they're using the metric system for this. So keep that in mind when you're reading the back of those labels. And that's the equivalent of about 1 teaspoon in the imperial system and no more than 1,500 milligrams in the metric system. So it says no more than 2,300 milligrams, but that's really our upper limit. We don't want to have more than about 1,500 milligrams. So that's really not a lot considering how much is generally in our food. We also want to make sure that we check out what salt is really used for and what it means. So since salt only has 40% sodium, that means every 10 grams of salt that we eat, 4 grams is sodium, and the rest of it is chlorine. So that's why they have us multiply it by 2.5 to make sure that if they've listed it as sodium, we know how much salt is truly in there. And the word salt comes from the Latin word sal, which means salt, S-A-L. It used to be a super valuable commodity and was used as currency. So the word salary also comes from the word salt. That doesn't really help you pick out your foods and your sodium in your food, but I really like the etymology of words, so I thought I would share that with you as well. We use salt a lot in flavoring and preserving foods. I mentioned that about Old Yeller as well as Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. They talk about that a lot. They also use it to tan hides. So in preparing like deer hides and such for making sure you're able to use them in different contexts. And you can use it in dyeing things. So if you've ever done some tie-dye, you know that certain types of material require adding salt to it and other types require adding vinegar or other compounds. It just depends on whether you're using different types of silk versus if you are going to be dyeing polyester or if you're going to be dyeing cotton. It just depends. They've also used it extensively in bleaching over the years, as well as in producing pottery, soap, and chlorine. If you ever are swimming in a pool and it's a chlorine pool, you might notice it still tastes a little salty if you get some of it in your mouth. And that is because it has some sodium in it as well. So sodium chloride, sodium and chlorine, that is table salt. You're going to have a little bit of that mixed together in your pool water. And if you have a saltwater pool, even more salt at that point. If you make soap from home, like goat's milk soap, then you may use a hot or a cold process. A hot process means that you're heating it up on the stove, and the cold process means that you're doing it chemically. So you're not cooking it on a stove, but you're just mixing it together with like some lye to help aid the chemical process and with chemical heat. And you're also using a little bit of salt and some other types of nutrients and minerals in order to mix that really all together and get the effect that you're needed. So today we use it a lot in chemical industries as well. It's not just for food. Most commonly in the kitchen, we see that in table salt as regular table salt, also rock salt, which you might use if you're making ice cream or if you're making a Brazilian dish such as picanha, which we make a lot in our home. You might be adding that to your food as well. You could also have sea salt, Himalayan salt, kosher salt. There are so many types of salt. My friend Tara has a bajillion different kinds and they all taste differently. I also have truffle salt. There's gray salt. It goes on and they all taste a lot differently, particularly if they're smoked. So there's a lot to explore out there, but you do want to make sure that you have a healthy amount of iodized salt in your diet. Super high levels of salt or sodium can be hidden in everyday foods, including fast food and frozen chicken, because they pump it full of saline to make it a little bit heavier and also to make it last longer. So they're trying to charge you more as well, which is really why I recommend those butchers. A lot of times folks think butchers are going to be more expensive than their local shops, but sometimes that's not the case because they are not adding a lot of those additives to it. All right, we're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the effects of sodium on our bodies.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Talking about the etymology of the word salt and some fast facts about them, including how it works in our bodies. Now we're going to wrap up with some different effects that salt has on our bodies. So our body really needs salt for those sodium-potassium ion exchange pumps and for water in our bodies. Keeping a proper balance of fluids and sodium is super important for our heart health, liver health, and kidney health. It not only regulates our body fluids, like our blood, but it also prevents low blood pressure. So you can have too much or too little salt. If you have too little salt, then your low sodium levels can be a big problem and you having too much fluid in your body, like in the case of hypernatremia. So you'll have more fluid retention at that point. In that case, a lot of doctors are going to give you diuretics to make you pee some more and to reduce that fluid retention, to get those fluids out and balance how much water versus sodium is in your body. If you have too low of sodium over a prolonged amount of time, you may be experiencing issues related to Addison's disease. You could have a blockage in your small intestine, some burns. The most common cause of this is going to be diarrhea or vomiting. So we think about that as losing fluids. But it's not just about losing the fluids in diarrhea or vomiting. They recommend Gatorade or Pedialyte in those instances because those are going to give you those electrolytes, that sodium and potassium as well, to keep everything working properly. So you're not just restoring fluid with Pedialyte and with Gatorade, you're also restoring those electrolytes. And if you've seen the movie Idiocracy, you know that's what plants crave. So in that case, we want to make sure that we're getting everything in there. You may also have an underactive thyroid or some heart issues, or you may be drinking too much water. Even with water where it doesn't have anything else added in it, too much of anything can be too much of a good thing. So if you have sodium levels that are too low in your blood, that can also impact how your brain functions. You might feel really tired or slow at that point. You could have muscle twitches. So if you're having like a twitch in your eye or other parts of your muscles, you may not be getting enough sodium in your body. So we think about it as having too much, but you may also have too little. So we want to really read those nutrition labels and pay attention to how much is in each serving to make sure we're getting enough, as well as making sure we're not getting too much. It's a delicate balance. So you may end up getting seizures from it. You could lose consciousness, have a coma, or even die. So if your sodium levels fall very quickly, that could happen to you very fast. And older people are more likely to experience that and have more severe symptoms and a quicker onset. So the older you get, the more important it is to keep these things in mind. They performed a study a few years back, and they found that when rats were not given enough sodium, then they kept away from activities that they used to enjoy normally. And that research suggests that sodium could act as an antidepressant. So if you find that you are dealing with depression, you may want to really look at how much sodium you're keeping in your diet. Maybe just keep a little journal of it each day. You could also talk to your doctor about it, but they're likely also going to encourage you to keep that journal, to bring it to them so they can keep an eye on actually how much sodium you're getting, because they're only able to tell what you're able to tell them. You're self-reporting your symptoms and everything to them. But if you have a solid record of specific numbers, like in a journal, that makes it a lot easier for them to draw that distinction between whether this is an underactive thyroid condition versus you having perhaps a blockage in your small intestine or just not taking in enough sodium to begin with. So just like we've talked about how fiber is integral in the gut to dealing with depression, so is sodium. And that is not something that had really occurred to me prior to performing this research. So I hope that that helps you guys as much as it's helping me. Alternatively, you can have too much sodium, and that can result in issues related to osteoporosis. I know, it's weird. Like, you cannot get enough salt and then your bones are too porous and they're not acting appropriately. That's super weird. I get it with the kidneys and the high blood pressure / hypertension and the cardiovascular disease and especially ischemic stroke. But osteoporosis kind of really stuck out there for me. And it's super weird, but it is a reality. The American Heart Association says that when you have too little sodium in your blood, it's going to pull more water into your bloodstream, and that's going to increase the volume of your blood. So it's going to be more water at that point, and your heart is going to have to work harder to pump that throughout the body. Remember, your arteries carry blood away from the heart, and your veins carry it back to the heart. So if you have too much volume in there, it's going to be hard, not just on your heart, but also stretching the walls of those blood vessels, of your arteries and your veins and your capillaries, the smaller ones. And that can make it more susceptible to damage. So we want to be very mindful about that as we go along. If you have high blood pressure, that can also lead to the buildup of more plaque in your arteries, which can in turn lead to a higher risk of having a stroke or cardiovascular disease, as well as a host of other problems. The American Heart Association also encourages folks to have more potassium at the same time that they're reducing their sodium intake. That goes back to that sodium-potassium exchange pump I've discussed with you that I learned about when I was studying biology in college, and that really helps lessen the negative effects of the sodium. You need a balance between that sodium and potassium. Now, if you're like me and you're not a big fan of bananas, you're going to have to get your potassium from a different manner. In the South, we call it getting foundered on something. So when I was a kid, my grandmother would give me bananas a lot when I would ask for a snack. And I just got sick of the taste after a while. So I got foundered on them. So now I do not like bananas. I try them about every 6 months, just like I do coconut, which I threw up as a child. So that really bothered me in the flavor for it, and it kind of set the tone for the rest of my life and how I feel about that food. So I try them every now and then, but I still just have this deep-rooted association with them and not feeling great that I'm not really able to eat them as much. And if you're like me, then you just need to find an alternative source of potassium. That's all. It's not that they're only available in potatoes or in bananas rather, but that there are different ways you can get them. And just like any other facet of dieting, it's important to find what is right for you. Sodium has also been shown to super overstimulate your immune system. So if you have an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis or MS or lupus or different types of allergies or other conditions, those may be exacerbated by a lot of sodium. So if you're having a lot of allergic reactions or a lot of outbreaks or just a lot of different troubles with lupus being worsened than it normally is or RA being worsened or MS, then maybe examine how much sodium you're intaking. Just like when I'm sad and I look at how much fiber I've been intaking, and sometimes that really helps me a lot. It's important to keep that in mind as well. Also, some research studies have found that kids who eat a lot of salty foods are more likely to drink a sugary drink with it, and that combination could increase the risk of obesity and diabetes as well, with insulin resistance issues. They prey upon that in bars as well. That's why you see a lot of salted nuts at bars if you frequent them at all, and it makes you thirstier because you're having more sodium in your body, and so your body is like, oh, I have more salt, now I want more to drink. And you're at a bar, so you tend to get a beer or another alcoholic beverage, and that helps them sell more stuff. So keep that in mind if you're drinking or eating something salty, or if you're having salty snacks at a bar. That can be a big deal as well. So we get salt and sodium naturally in seawater or in the crystalline version in rock salt, and it largely comes from processed and convenience foods in our diet today. However, some natural and unprocessed foods also have it, so meats, seafood, eggs, some types of veggies, and dairy products like we talked about with that 1 cup of milk earlier having 100 milligrams of sodium in it. And there are a ton of salty foods in the U.S. The top 6, according to the American Heart Association, are breads and rolls, pizza, soup, sandwiches, poultry, and cold cuts and other cured meats. Not necessarily in that order. So that is a lot. If you're having sea salt, rock salt, or kosher salt, that all contains about 40% sodium by weight, and the rest of that 60% tends to be that chlorine. They may also have some potassium and other minerals, but in very minuscule amounts. So we want to use all types of salt in moderation. So remember, The average American eats about 3.4 grams of sodium every day, and we're aiming for 2.3 grams or 2,300 milligrams or less. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and the American Heart Association recommend having a max of 1,500 milligrams. So you're aiming for between 1,500 milligrams and 2,300 milligrams as your absolute max. And the 1,500 is just over half a teaspoon of table salt. That 2,300 is about a teaspoon of table salt. So keep that in mind, especially if you're prone to high blood pressure, diabetes, or cardiovascular disease. So to put that in context for you guys, 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day looks like one egg up to 140 milligrams. 230 grams of fresh milk is 50 milligrams. 200 grams of plain yogurt, 40 milligrams of sodium. 200 grams of natural low-fat yogurt has 76 milligrams of sodium. So you might think that the plain yogurt is going to have a little bit less in it, but the natural one would have less in it, but the natural one has almost twice as much as regular plain yogurt. So the natural low-fat one supplements the fat with flavoring from sodium in there. 50 grams of raw celery has about 140 milligrams. We think of celery as being super chill because it is, and it's mostly like a high water and fiber content, but 50 grams of raw celery is still 140 milligrams of sodium. It's just naturally within that vegetable. And 60 grams of cooked spinach without any added salt in the cooking process has 120 milligrams of salt in it alone. So check that out. Raw vegetables tend to be lower in sodium, but if they are also canned, then they have added sodium in them and tend to have a far higher sodium and overall salt content. Remember, if it says sodium on there in the label instead of salt, multiply that times 2.5 to get how much you are going to be getting per day. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.